Chicago in late November did not just bite. It chewed. The wind off Lake Michigan whipped through the canyons of the Loop, carrying a damp, bone-deep chill that turned the breath of commuters into fleeting ghosts. Inside the gilded plate, the atmosphere was a sharp, calculated contrast. Here the air was heavy with the scent of roasted Arabica, expensive leather, and the faint metallic tang of the steam wand. Lily adjusted the collar of her starch-stiffened black polo for the 10th time that morning. Her fingers were chapped, the skin around her nails raw from a combination of industrial-strength lemon bleach and the abrasive cold of her 3-block walk from the subway station. At 23, Lily was a master of the service lean, a posture that made her look attentive yet entirely non-threatening, a background element designed to facilitate the comfort of people who spent more on a single lunch than she did on a month's rent for her basement studio in Pilsen. She wasn't just a waitress, though the world saw nothing else. Behind her tired hazel eyes, a second world was constantly running. As she balanced a tray of heavy ceramic cups, she wasn't just thinking about the order. She was calculating the center of gravity, the torque on her wrist, and the structural integrity of the tray's cantilevered edge. While she wiped down the mahogany tables, she traced the wood grain, her mind visualizing the load-bearing capacity of the floor joists beneath the marble. "Lily, table 4's flagging," the floor manager Marcus barked. He didn't look up from his tablet. He never did. To him, Lily was a metric, a unit of labor that moved at a certain speed. "On it," she replied. Her voice was soft, worn smooth by the repetitive scripts of hospitality. At table 4 sat Arthur. He was a man who seemed to occupy more space than his physical frame required. Even sitting down, draped in a charcoal wool overcoat that probably cost 3 of Lily's semesters, he radiated a restless, vibrating energy. He was 30, perhaps 32, with sharp aristocratic features that were currently pinched in a mask of profound irritation. Before him sat a scattering of blueprints weighted down by a heavy brass paperweight and a half-empty cup of espresso that had long since gone cold. He was staring at a specific intersection of lines on a large-scale drawing, his jaw muscles working rhythmically. Arthur was a man who had built a career and a reputation on being right. But for the last 6 weeks, something in the blueprints for the Aegis Tower had been wrong. Crucially, fundamentally wrong. Lily approached with a fresh pot of water, her movements silent. She didn't speak immediately. She had learned that men like Arthur didn't want to be interrupted. They wanted to be served by osmosis. She refilled his glass, the water swirling in a perfect crystalline vortex. Arthur didn't look up. He didn't even acknowledge the hand that placed the glass. To him, Lily was an extension of the restaurant's machinery, no more significant than the heating vent humming in the ceiling. He let out a sharp, jagged exhale, a sound of pure intellectual defeat, and grabbed a paper napkin from the dispenser. With a frantic, aggressive hand, he began scribbling equations in the margin of the napkin, his fountain pen scratching against the cheap quilted paper. "It's the wind load," he muttered to himself, his voice a low gravel. "The dampening system isn't compensating for the secondary oscillation at the 64th floor. It's impossible." Lily stood there for a heartbeat too long. She shouldn't have looked. She knew she shouldn't have looked. But her eyes, trained by years of late-night study over cracked textbooks, couldn't help but track the numbers he was scrawling. She saw the variable he was using for the Reynolds number, the fluid dynamics of the air hitting the glass skin of the tower. He's using a static coefficient for a dynamic system, she thought. The realization hit her like a physical spark. He's treating the wind like a wall, not a wave. "Sir?" she asked quietly. Arthur's pen stopped. He looked up, and for the first time his eyes met hers. They were a piercing, stormy blue, clouded by exhaustion and a mounting sense of failure. He looked at her not as a person, but as an interruption. "Another espresso," he snapped, his voice cold. "And clear this." He gestured dismissively toward the cold cup and the scattered napkins. "Of course," Lily said, her face flushing. She reached for the tray, her heart hammering against her ribs. Arthur stood up abruptly, his phone vibrating on the table. He snatched it up, already talking before he had even turned away. I told the board we'd have the revised stress test results by noon. I don't care if the servers are down, get them back up. He strode toward the door, his long coat billowing behind him like a cape, leaving a trail of expensive cologne and unresolved tension in his wake. Lily stood at the empty table. The wind from the opening door whistled through the bistro, fluttering the edges of the blueprints he'd left behind. Among the debris was the napkin. She picked it up. It was damp from a ring of condensation, the ink beginning to bleed. Most people would have seen a mess of chicken scratch. Lily saw a tragedy of errors. Arthur was trying to solve a 21st century problem with 20th century math. She looked around. The bistro was in that lull between the breakfast rush and the power lunch. Marcus was in the back. The busboy was busy in the kitchen. Lily reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her own pen, a cheap plastic ballpoint with a bitten cap. Her hand trembled. This was a violation of every rule she lived by. She was a ghost. She was supposed to stay invisible. If she was caught messing with a client's work, she'd be fired on the spot, and the tuition for her final engineering exam would remain an impossible dream. But the error was screaming at her. It was a jagged tooth in a perfect smile. She leaned over the table, her breath hitching. She didn't cross out his work. She simply added a single line, a correction to the dampening constant, a way to account for the vortex shedding that Arthur had completely ignored. She wrote the Greek letter lambda, followed by a series of coordinates that shifted the center of mass by a mere 4 centimeters. 4 centimeters. In a 90-story building, it was the difference between a masterpiece and a catastrophe. She finished the final bracket, her heart leaping into her throat as she heard the chime of the door. A group of businessmen in suits were walking in. Quickly, she crumpled the napkin, not enough to ruin it, but enough to make it look like trash, and tucked it under the edge of his discarded saucer. She spent the next 4 hours in a daze. Every time she passed table 4, she felt a cold sweat break out on her neck. She waited for him to come back. She waited for him to complain. She waited for the world to notice the girl who had dared to speak in the language of giants. But the afternoon turned into evening. The golden Chicago sun dipped below the skyline, casting long, bruised shadows across the bistro floor. Arthur didn't return. At the end of her shift, Lily stood in the locker room, her back aching, her feet throbbing in her cheap flats. She pulled out her textbook, Structural Analysis, 8th edition, and stared at the pages. The numbers usually felt like friends, a secret code that promised a way out. But tonight, they felt like a heavy weight. She thought of Arthur's face, the way he hadn't seen her, the way his blue eyes had looked right through her skin as if she were made of glass. "Hey, Lily," the busboy Noah said as he walked by, hauling a heavy bag of linens. "You left a mess on table 4 today. Some guy left his trash everywhere." Lily froze. "The napkins?" "Yeah, tossed 'em," Noah said with a shrug. "Who writes on napkins anyway? Use a computer, right?" Lily felt a pang of sharp, unexpected grief. The correction was gone. The bridge she had tried to build between her invisible world and his magnificent one had been swept into a dumpster. "Right," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the industrial dishwasher. "Just trash." She walked out into the biting Chicago night, the wind catching her thin jacket. She was invisible again. She was just a waitress. And Arthur, wherever he was still building a tower that was destined to fail, never knowing that the answer had been sitting right under his coffee cup, written by a girl whose name he would never bother to learn. But as she reached the subway stairs, a black town car idled at the curb. The window was tinted, but for a second she thought she saw the silhouette of a man staring at a crumpled piece of paper under a dome light. Lily shook her head, the cold numbing her thoughts. Don't be a fool, she told herself. People like him don't look back. She disappeared into the maw of the subway, the steel gates clanging shut behind her. A soft cliffhanger in the rhythm of the city. Arthur did not sleep. In his penthouse overlooking the jagged teeth of the Chicago skyline, the silence was absolute. save for the hum of the climate control. He sat at a drafting table made of reclaimed oak and tempered glass, but he wasn't looking at his high-resolution monitors. He was staring at a crumpled, stained piece of paper that smelled faintly of cheap espresso and lemon-scented cleaning fluid. He had returned to the bistro only minutes after leaving. A sudden, nagging realization had hit him in the back of the town car, a variable he'd forgotten to carry over. He'd stormed back in to retrieve his napkins, only to find the table already cleared. He had pulled the napkin from the top of a bus tub, ignoring the confused look of the boy in the apron. Now, under the sterile glow of an architect's lamp, the correction looked even more impossible. The handwriting was precise, delicate but firm. The Greek letter lambda was drawn with a mathematical elegance that suggested years of repetition, but it was the logic that haunted him. Whoever had picked up that pen hadn't just corrected his math, they had understood his intent. They had seen the Aegis Tower not as a heap of steel, but as a living thing that needed to breathe with the wind. "Who are you?" Arthur whispered, his voice cracking in the empty room. The next morning, the wind had turned into a sleet-heavy rain that turned the Chicago streets into a gray, slick labyrinth. Arthur arrived at the Gilded Plate at 9:45 a.m. He didn't sit at table 4. He sat at the far end of the polished brass counter, where he had a clear view of the entire floor. He watched the staff. He watched the hurried waiters with their buzzing tablets. He watched the hostess with her practiced, vacuous smile. And then he saw her. Lily was moving between tables with a tray of heavy porcelain. She was different today, or perhaps he was simply seeing her for the first time. She moved with a strange, rhythmic efficiency. When she set a plate down, she didn't just drop it. She placed it in a way that accounted for the tilt of the table. She adjusted a wobbling chair leg with a folded piece of cardboard she pulled from her pocket, her movements so fluid they were almost invisible. He felt a jolt of skepticism. A waitress? No. It's a trick. A rival firm sent someone to mock me. Lily felt the weight of his gaze before she saw him. It was a physical sensation like a static charge in the air. When she finally turned toward the counter and saw the man in the charcoal overcoat, her heart didn't just skip, it plummeted. He was back. And he wasn't looking at a blueprint, he was looking at her. She tried to stay in the kitchen, busying herself with polishing silverware until her reflection in the knives looked distorted and anxious. "Lily, table 10 needs their check," Marcus snapped, "and the guy at the counter is asking for you specifically." Lily froze. "The man in the overcoat?" "Yeah, Mr. Aegis Tower himself." "Don't screw it up, Lily. He's got enough money to buy this block and turn it into a parking lot." Lily smoothed her apron, her hands trembling. She walked toward the counter, her shoes squeaking on the damp floor. The scent of his expensive tobacco and cold rain grew stronger. As she approached, Arthur didn't look up from the notebook he had open on the marble. "I didn't think you'd come back," she said, her voice a fragile thread. Arthur slowly turned the notebook toward her. On the page was a new equation, 10 times more complex than the one from the day before. It was a problem involving the secondary harmonic resonance of a high-rise foundation. It was a trap. "I left something behind yesterday," Arthur said, his blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that felt like an interrogation. "A correction. Do you know anything about it?" Lily looked at the notebook. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. Behind her, she could hear Marcus watching. To admit she had touched his work was to admit she had stepped out of her place. "I was just cleaning the table, sir," she lied, her eyes dropping to his hands. The napkins were trash. Arthur leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous velvet. "The person who wrote this used a Reynolds number variance that isn't taught in standard American universities. They used the Leningrad method. It's more elegant, more dangerous. It's the kind of math someone uses when they've had to learn the hard way." He slid a pen across the counter. It was a heavy silver fountain pen. "Finish the sequence on this page," he commanded, "and I'll leave you alone." Lily looked at the pen. The light caught the silver nib. This was the moment of no return. She could walk away, stay a ghost, and eventually fade into the gray Chicago fog. Or she could reach out and claim the mind she had spent 10 years hiding. The bistro around them seemed to fade. The clinking of silverware, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of the rain. It all became a distant hum. There was only the white paper and the man waiting for her to fail. Lily reached out. Her chapped, red-knuckled fingers closed around the cool silver of the pen. She felt the weight of it, the weight of a world she wasn't supposed to belong to. She didn't sit down. She leaned over the counter, the tip of the pen hovering over the paper. Then she began to write. She didn't hesitate. The numbers flowed out of her like a long suppressed scream. She accounted for the soil elasticity. She factored in the seismic dampening. As she worked, her posture changed. The service lean vanished. Her shoulders squared. For 3 minutes, she wasn't a waitress at the Gilded Plate. She was the smartest person in the city of Chicago. She clicked the pen shut and slid it back to him. Arthur stared at the page. His breath hitched. It was perfect. It was more than perfect. It was beautiful. He looked up at her, and the cynicism that had defined his face for a decade was gone, replaced by a raw, naked wonder. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "In the basement of the public library," Lily said, her voice gaining a sudden sharp edge of pride. "Under the covers in my apartment when the power was out. From textbooks I found in the free bin at the university." She looked at her hands, embarrassed by their roughness. "I'm a waitress, Mr. Blackwood. I spend my days carrying plates and my nights carrying the weight of buildings I'll never be allowed to build." Arthur reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the counter. He didn't touch her. The distance between them was still a vast social chasm, but the air between their hands felt warm, charged with a new kind of tension. "I'm not here to buy a parking lot," Arthur said, his eyes softening as they searched hers. "I'm here because my tower is falling, and I think you're the only one who can see why." "I have a shift to finish," Lily said, though she didn't move. "When do you close?" 11. "But I have to walk to the station." "I'll wait," Arthur said. "You can't wait here for 12 hours, sir," Lily said with a small unintended smile. "I've waited 6 years for a conversation this interesting," Arthur replied, his voice firm. "I think I can manage 12 hours. He picked up his notebook, but as he turned to go to a corner table, he stopped. "What's your name?" "Lily," she said. "Lily," he repeated. He said it like a discovery, a new element added to his periodic table. "My name is Arthur, but I think you already knew that." As he walked away, Lily stood frozen at the counter. She could feel the eyes of the other waitresses on her. She could feel Marcus's confusion. But mostly she felt a terrifying, exhilarating crack in the ceiling of her world. The search was over. He had found the shadow, and he had brought it into the light. But as the rain continued to lash against the windows, Lily realized that the light was far more dangerous than the dark. The clock above the espresso machine clicked. 11 hours p.m. The last customer, a weary traveler with a rolling suitcase, had vanished into the Chicago night 10 minutes ago. Marcus was in the back office, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a heavy stapler signaling the end of the day's accounting. Lily stood by the front door, her coat buttoned to her chin, her scarf wrapped twice around her neck. Her fingers, still smelling of citrus degreaser, fumbled with the heavy brass lock. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. The rain had ceased, leaving the city glazed in a treacherous, shimmering ice. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. She looked toward the corner, expecting to see nothing but the amber glow of the street lamps and the occasional yellow streak of a taxi. But he was there. Arthur was leaning against the brick facade of the building next door, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his overcoat. He looked smaller than he had in the bistro, less like a titan of industry and more like a man waiting for a bus that might never come. His hair was damp, and a fine silver mist of frost had settled on the wool of his shoulders. "You stayed," Lily said. It wasn't a question. It was an admission of her own disbelief. "I said I would," Arthur replied. His voice was raspy, worn down by the hours of cold. He didn't move toward her immediately, respecting the invisible boundary she had drawn between them. I have the revised schematics in the car. It's warm there, or we could find a diner. Lily looked down the street toward the subway entrance. The thought of her cold, damp basement apartment, with its single flickering bulb and the smell of old paper, felt suddenly unbearable. The diner on 4th is open all night, she said quietly. They don't mind if people linger over books. The diner was a relic of chrome and cracked vinyl, lit by buzzing neon that cast a flickering pink hue over everything. They sat in a corner booth, far from the two truckers arguing over the price of diesel at the counter. Arthur laid out the blueprints for the Aegis Tower. They were massive, smelling of ammonia and fresh ink, covering the entire table and spilling over the edges. "Show me," Arthur said. He wasn't commanding now, he was asking. He handed her the silver fountain pen. Lily hesitated, then began to draw. For the next hour, the world narrowed down to the radius of the pen's nib. They spoke in the shorthand of engineers: vectors, load paths, thermal expansion coefficients. Arthur watched her intently, his exhaustion forgotten. He noticed how she held the pen, not like a tool but like a weapon. He noticed the way her brow furrowed when she hit a particularly stubborn variable, and the way she bit her lower lip when she found the solution. "The secondary oscillation," she whispered, her finger tracing a line of steel. "You're trying to fight the wind. You can't fight it, Arthur, you have to invite it in. If you change the perforation on the south-facing panels, the air will bleed through rather than pushing against the structure." Arthur leaned in. Their heads were inches apart, the scent of her cheap shampoo, something flowery and synthetic, mixing with the rich, heavy aroma of his coffee. "Vortex shedding," he murmured. "I thought of it, but the aesthetics. The client wanted a solid glass facade. Then the client wants a tombstone," Lily said, her hazel eyes flashing with a sudden fierce intelligence. "A building is a living thing. It has to breathe. If you don't give it a set of lungs, it'll suffocate under its own weight." Arthur went still. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a mathematical anomaly, but as a woman who saw the world with more clarity than anyone he had ever met in a boardroom. "Why are you in a bistro, Lily?" he asked. The question was soft, devoid of judgment, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken tragedies. Lily's hand faltered. She pulled back slightly, the intimacy of the moment fracturing. She looked at her chapped knuckles, the skin stained with the ink of his pen. "I had a full ride to UChicago," she said, her voice flat as if she were reciting a grocery list. 3 years ago, my mother got sick, gastric cancer. The insurance didn't cover the palliative care, and the full ride didn't cover the rent or the medicine. I took a semester off to work. 1 semester became 2. 2 became a year. Then the scholarship was revoked because I wasn't actively enrolled. She gave a small, bitter laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm 6 credits short of a degree. But when you owe the university $12,000 in back fees, they don't give you your transcripts. And without transcripts, nobody hires an engineer. So, I carry plates. I wait for people like you to finish their coffee so I can clear the table and hope for a $5 tip." Arthur felt a sharp, cold pang in his chest. He lived in a world where $12,000 was the cost of a rug or a weekend in Aspen. To see it as a wall standing between this brilliant mind and her future felt like a personal failure of the universe. "I didn't know," he said. "Why would you?" Lily replied. She reached out and touched the edge of the blueprint. "But tonight I'm not a waitress. Tonight I'm the lead structural consultant on the tallest building in the Midwest, even if it's just for an hour in a greasy diner." Arthur reached across the table. His hand covered hers just for a second. His skin was warm, his grip firm. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement. A tether. "You're not just a consultant for an hour," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You're the reason this building will stand. I want you to come to the firm, tomorrow." Lily pulled her hand away, her breath hitching. "I can't. I have the morning shift. If I miss it, Marcus will— Forget Marcus, Arthur interrupted. I'll pay your back fees. I'll get your transcripts. I'll hire you as my personal assistant or a junior architect or whatever title makes you feel safe. Just don't go back to that table, Lily. It's not that simple, she whispered, her eyes filling with a sudden hot moisture. I don't need a savior, Arthur. I need to earn it. If you just give it to me, then I'm just another charity case. I've spent 3 years being looked down on. I won't start doing it to myself. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the hum of the diner's refrigerator and the distant sound of a snowplow. Arthur looked at her, seeing the pride that was both her greatest strength and her most painful armor. Then earn it, he said. Come to the site at 8 a.m. Look at the foundation pour. If you can find the flaw in the reinforcement grid that my lead foreman is insisting isn't there, I'll hire you on a standard contract. No charity, just talent. Lily looked at the blueprints, then at the man across from her. The bridge was there. It was narrow and it was dangerous and it was covered in ice. But for the first time in years, she saw a way across. 8 o'clock, she said. As they walked out of the diner, the Chicago wind roared between the buildings. Arthur walked her to the subway entrance. At the top of the stairs, he stopped. He reached out and adjusted her scarf, his fingers brushing against the sensitive skin of her neck. The touch lingered, a fraction of a second too long to be accidental. Be careful, Lily, he said. The city is unforgiving at this hour. I'm used to it, she replied. She descended into the darkness of the station, the silver pen tucked safely in her pocket. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes on her until the turnstile clicked. She was halfway home before she realized she was smiling, a real, terrifying smile that felt like the beginning of a storm. The air at the construction site of the Aegis Tower was thick with the scent of pulverized stone, diesel exhaust, and the metallic tang of welding sparks. At 8 a.m., the sun was a pale, heatless disk, struggling to pierce through the low-hanging Chicago clouds. Lily stood at the edge of the massive excavation pit, her old boots caked in yellow clay. She felt exposed. Without her waitress apron and the familiar chaos of the bistro, she felt like a soldier who had wandered onto a battlefield without armor. Arthur was already there, pacing the perimeter of the reinforcement grid. He was wearing a white hard hat and a high-visibility vest over his tailored coat, a look that should have been jarring but instead made him look like a man finally in his element. He spotted her and gestured toward the maze of rebar. The foreman says the tensioning cables are set to specification, Arthur said as she approached. His eyes were bloodshot, his face tight. The board is pushing for the first pour in 2 hours. If we delay, it costs the firm $50,000 a day. A man with a face like weathered leather and a voice like grinding gravel stepped forward. This was Silas, the lead foreman, a man who had been pouring concrete since before Lily was born. He looked at Lily's worn jacket and her small frame, and he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. Mr. Blackwood, with all due respect, who is this? Silas asked, his eyes narrowing. This isn't the city inspector. She's a consultant, Arthur said, his voice ringing with a finality that brooked no argument. Lily, look at the southeast corner of the grid. Tell me what you see. Lily stepped onto the narrow catwalk. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, but as she looked down at the steel cage that would hold the weight of 90 floors, the noise in her head went quiet. She saw the blueprints in her mind, the elegant Leningrad method she had used at the diner. She looked at the spacing of the stirrups, the steel loops that held the vertical bars in place. She knelt, her knees hitting the cold metal of the catwalk. She pulled a small measuring tape from her pocket, the one she usually used to check the level of the bistro tables. It's not the cables, Silas, she said, her voice steadying as the logic took over. It's the sheer reinforcement. You've spaced the stirrups at 20 centimeters, but the curvature of the foundation wall creates a torsion force here that requires 10-centimeter spacing for the first 3 meters. Silas let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Listen, honey, I've followed the specs provided by the engineering lead. The math says 20 is plenty. The math you're using assumes a static load, Lily countered, standing up. She didn't look at Arthur. She looked straight at Silas. But this tower is designed to sway. In a high-wind event, the torque on this corner will exceed the concrete's tensile strength. If you pour this now, the foundation will develop microcracks before the glass is even installed. You won't see it today, but in 5 years, the aegis will start to lean. The silence that followed was heavy. Silas looked at Arthur, expecting a dismissal. Instead, Arthur looked at the grid, then back at Lily. He saw the way she stood, the same fierce, quiet pride he had seen in the diner. "Silas," Arthur said softly, "remeasure the southeast corner. If she's right, we retie the steel before the trucks arrive." "But the cost—" "I'll eat the cost," Arthur snapped. "Do it." 40 minutes later, Silas climbed back up from the pit, his face pale beneath the grime. He didn't say a word. He simply signaled the crew to bring in more rebar. Lily had been right. She had saved the tower from a slow-motion disaster. The victory should have felt sweet, but as Arthur drove her from the site to the headquarters of Blackwood and Associates, the reality of the class divide began to settle in. Arthur's office was a cathedral of glass and minimalist steel on the 40th floor of a neighboring high-rise. The floors were polished white marble. The air was chilled and smelled of nothing at all. As Lily walked through the lobby, people turned to stare. She was covered in sight dust. Her hair was windswept and tangled. Her old coat looked like a rag against the backdrop of Italian silk suits and designer dresses. "Stay here," Arthur said, ushering her into his private office, a room larger than her entire apartment. "I have a meeting with the partners. We'll talk about your contract afterward." He paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze felt like a judgment. "There's a boutique in the lobby. I'll call down and have them send up some things for you. You shouldn't have to walk around like that." "Like what, Arthur?" Lily asked, her voice low. "In the dirt," he said, his intent kind, but his words clumsy. "I want them to see you the way I see you, as a peer." He left before she could respond. An hour later, a woman in a sharp uniform arrived with 3 garment bags. Inside were clothes that cost more than Lily's tuition: a charcoal gray power suit, a silk blouse the color of a winter sky, and shoes with heels that looked like glass daggers. Lily stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in Arthur's private restroom. She put the clothes on. She looked like a stranger. The silk was cool against her skin, a luxury she didn't know how to wear. But as she looked at her hands, still red, still chapped, still smelling of the construction site, the reflection felt like a lie. She wasn't a peer. She was a project. The afternoon was a blur of high-stakes tension. Arthur brought her into a conference room filled with the firm's top architects. He introduced her as a structural specialist he'd been scouting. He didn't mention the bistro. He didn't mention the free textbooks. He kept her background vague, a protective layer of mystery. But the corporate world was filled with sharks who could smell blood in the water. Julian, a senior partner with a smile like a razor blade and a pedigree that stretched back to the founding of the city, watched Lily with a calculated suspicion. He noticed the way she didn't know which fork to use during the catered lunch. He noticed the way she flinched when the elevator chimed. "So, Lily," Julian said, leaning back in his leather chair, his eyes fixed on her. "Arthur says you studied the Leningrad method. Fascinating. Which university? I don't recall seeing many Americans specializing in that particular niche lately." Lily felt the air leave the room. She looked at Arthur, but he was busy on his phone, missing the predatory glint in Julian's eyes. I studied independently," Lily said, her voice catching. "Independently," Julian repeated, the word sounding like an insult. "How industrious. And where were you consulting before Arthur found you? I pride myself on knowing everyone in the Chicago circuit, yet your name doesn't appear on a single permit or registry." "I was working," Lily said, her jaw tightening. "In the Loop." "The Loop is a big place," Julian pushed, a cruel smile forming. "Funny thing, I was at the Gilded Plate yesterday for a breakfast meeting. I could have sworn I saw someone who looked remarkably like you, carrying a tray of eggs Benedict." The room went silent. The other architects looked up from their tablets. Arthur froze, his phone halfway to his ear. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight. Lily felt the shame wash over her, a hot, suffocating wave. She looked at the expensive silk sleeve of her blouse and felt like a thief. She looked at Arthur, hoping he would say something, anything to defend her. But Arthur's first instinct wasn't to defend her mind. It was to cover the scandal. "Julian, that's enough," Arthur said, his voice tight with an embarrassment that cut Lily deeper than Julian's mockery. Lily's background is irrelevant to her talent. She identified the foundation flaw this morning that our lead engineers missed. "Irrelevant," Julian laughed. "Arthur, you've brought a waitress into $1 million consultation. The board will lose their minds. If the press finds out the specialist saving the Aegis doesn't even have a degree, the firm's reputation is finished." "I'm getting her the degree," Arthur snapped, his voice rising. "I'm paying her fees. I'm fixing the situation." Lily stood up. The chair scraped harshly against the marble floor. "Fixing the situation?" she whispered. She looked at Arthur, and for the first time, the romantic spark she had felt in the diner was smothered by the cold reality of his world. He didn't see her as his equal. He saw her as something broken that needed to be repaired, hidden, and polished until it was acceptable to people like Julian. "Lily, wait," Arthur said, realizing his mistake. "You're ashamed of me," she said, her voice trembling not with sadness but with a cold, clear fury. "You like my mind, Arthur. You like the way I can save your building. But you're embarrassed by my life. You want the engineer, but you want to erase the waitress who worked for 3 years to keep that engineer alive." "That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant," Lily said. She began to strip off the expensive charcoal blazer, dropping it onto the chair. "I told you I didn't want a savior. I didn't want to be your charity case." She walked out of the conference room, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the marble. She didn't stop at the elevator. She took the stairs, flight after flight, her breath coming in ragged gasps. By the time she reached the lobby, she was shivering. She walked out into the Chicago afternoon. The wind was howling again, the chewer returning to claim the streets. She walked past the boutique where the clothes had come from. She walked past the town cars idling at the curb. She didn't go back to the bistro. She couldn't. She had burned that bridge the moment she touched Arthur's pen. But she didn't go back to Arthur either. She disappeared into the gray anonymous crowd of the city, a ghost returning to the shadows, leaving behind a half-finished tower, and a man who had finally realized that the only thing he couldn't build was a bridge to a woman he had failed to truly see. The storm was not merely a weather event, it was a reckoning. It moved in from the lake with a low predatory growl, turning the Chicago sky the color of a fresh bruise. The chewer had reached its final form, a gale force monster that sent trash cans tumbling like dice down the alleyways and made the glass panes of the city's skyscrapers groan in their frames. Lily sat in her basement apartment, the only light coming from a single low-wattage desk lamp that hummed with the instability of the power grid. On her scarred wooden table sat two things: the silver fountain pen Arthur had given her, and her final engineering textbook. She had spent the last 48 hours in a state of suspended animation. She had called into the bistro to quit, her pride unable to face the sympathetic looks of the other waitresses. She was back in the shadows, where it was safe, but the silence of the room was suffocating. Suddenly, the radiator beneath the window let out a sharp metallic hiss, followed by a rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards. Lily froze. She knew that frequency. It wasn't the radiator. It was the wind hitting a massive structure nearby, a resonant vibration that was traveling through the very bedrock of the city. She turned on her small, crackling radio. "Emergency crews are currently evacuating a 3-block radius around the Aegis Tower site." The announcer's voice was strained. "Reports indicate that the unfinished structure is experiencing severe harmonic oscillations. High-altitude sensors are recording sways of over 2 meters. Engineers fear a structural failure of the upper gantries." Lily's heart stopped. The secondary oscillation. She had warned him. She had told him the building couldn't breathe. A heavy, frantic pounding at her door startled her. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor or the rhythmic rap of a delivery person. It was the sound of someone trying to break through a wall. Lily stood, her legs feeling like water. She walked to the door and pulled it open. Arthur stood in the narrow, dim hallway. He was unrecognizable. His charcoal coat was gone, replaced by a soaked, grease-stained jacket. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his face was gaunt, his eyes rimmed with red. He wasn't the titan of the 40th floor anymore. He was a man who had looked into the abyss and realized it was made of his own arrogance. "Lily," he rasped. He didn't step inside. He stayed in the hallway, his hands trembling at his sides. "I'm not here as your boss. I'm not here to offer you a suit or a scholarship." "Why are you here, Arthur?" Lily asked, her voice a whisper against the roar of the wind outside. "The tower is screaming," Arthur said, a tear carving a clean path through the dust on his cheek. "Julian and the board, they tried to use a standard dampening fix. They ignored your notes. They said you were a fluke, and now the 64th floor is tearing itself apart. I tried to solve it. I stayed up for 36 hours, but my math, it's static. It's dead. I can't see the wave, Lily. Only you can see the wave." He took a step forward, his voice breaking. "I don't care about the firm. I don't care about the building. But if that tower falls, it's not just steel that breaks. It's the proof that you were right. I won't let them bury your mind under a pile of rubble. Please, come with me. Not for me, for the tower." Lily looked at the silver pen on the table. She realized then that her disadvantage, the years of hunger, the double shifts, the studying by candlelight, had given her a kind of resilience Arthur's world could never understand. She didn't have a degree, but she had the truth. "Get the car," she said. The drive to the loop was a descent into chaos. Blue and red police lights fractured against the sheets of rain. The streets were empty of pedestrians, the only sound the terrifying, low-frequency hum of the Aegis as it fought the atmosphere. They reached the command trailer at the base of the site. Inside, the air was thick with panic. Julian was there, screaming into a satellite phone, his face pale and sweating. Silas and a dozen other senior engineers were huddled around a bank of monitors showing live stress strain data. "It's over, Arthur," Julian yelled as they burst in. "The oscillation has hit the critical threshold. We have to call for a controlled demolition of the upper tiers before it topples into the street." Arthur ignored him. He cleared a space on the central plotting table. "Lily," he said, and the way he spoke her name made the room go quiet. It wasn't a command. It was an introduction to a master. Lily stepped forward. She looked at the monitors. The numbers were jumping, a chaotic dance of failure. She saw the torsion in the southeast corner, the same corner she had warned Silas about. "The Leningrad method," she muttered, her eyes darting across the screens. "You're treating the wind as a linear force. It's not. It's a double helix vortex." "We don't have time for a lecture, girl," Julian barked. Arthur stepped between Lily and Julian, his eyes burning with a cold, protective fire. "If you speak to her again, I will throw you out of this trailer myself. She is the only person in this room who knows how to save this city. Now move." Lily grabbed a digital stylus. She didn't look at the board of directors. She didn't look at the men who had mocked her. She looked at the building. She saw the 64th floor in her mind, the way the air was hitting the perforated panels. "The dampers are fighting the sway," she said, her voice rising above the wind. "That's the mistake. We need to release the tension on the north side cables. Let the building lean into the wind. If we shift the center of mass by 6 centimeters to the west, we break the resonance. The building will stop fighting itself." "That's insane," Silas whispered. "If we release the cables in a 100-mile-per-hour wind, the whole thing could pivot." "It will pivot," Lily said, turning to him. "Exactly 6 centimeters, and then the vortex will shed, and the vibration will die. Do it now or the tower falls in 10 minutes. Arthur looked at the monitors, then at Lily. He saw the absolute, terrifying certainty in her eyes. He reached for the master override switch. "Arthur, don't!" Julian screamed. Arthur didn't blink. He looked at Lily, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a look of pure, unadulterated trust. "Release the north cables," he commanded. He flipped the switch. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. A deafening crack echoed through the trailer as the massive steel winches at the top of the tower let go. The building groaned, a sound so loud it felt like it was coming from the earth itself. On the monitors, the sway accelerated. The board members ducked, expecting the ceiling to collapse. And then, the vibration stopped. The jagged lines on the stress test monitors began to smooth out. The low-frequency hum that had been rattling the windows faded into a dull whistle. The Aegis Tower settled into its new center of mass, leaning ever so slightly into the storm, as if it were finally at rest. The silence in the trailer was absolute. Silas stared at the data, his mouth agape. Julian sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. Arthur didn't look at the monitors, he was looking at Lily. She was standing by the table, her chest heaving, her hands finally still. The light of the computer screens reflected in her hazel eyes, making them look like gold. "You did it," Arthur whispered. "We did it," she corrected softly. In that moment, the class divide, the shame of the bistro and the arrogance of the firm were gone. They were just two people standing in the eye of a storm they had survived together. The revelation wasn't just in the math, it was in the realization that Arthur would never have seen the truth if he hadn't learned to look at her. But as the wind continued to lash the trailer, the door swung open. A swarm of reporters and city officials were waiting outside, their cameras flashing. Julian stood up, adjusting his tie, his predatory instinct returning. He moved toward the door to take the credit, to spin the miraculous save for the morning news. Arthur caught Lily's eye. He saw the flicker of fear in her, the ghost wanting to retreat back into the shadows before the cameras could find her. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, warm, and public. He didn't let go. "Wait," Arthur said to the room. He turned Lily toward the door, toward the light and toward her future. The world needs to see who really saved the Aegis. The morning after the storm, Chicago was scrubbed clean. The sky was a pale, fragile blue, and the puddles on the sidewalk held the reflection of the buildings like mirrors. Inside the boardroom of Blackwood and Associates, the air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and the quiet hum of a crisis averted. Julian sat at the head of the table, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the mahogany surface. He had a press release prepared, one that spoke of the firm's collective ingenuity and proprietary structural innovations. He didn't look at Arthur, who was standing by the window, staring out at the Aegis Tower. The building stood tall and silent, its new slight lean into the west almost imperceptible to the naked eye, yet it was the only reason they weren't currently standing in a field of glass and steel shards. "We've scheduled the announcement for 10, Julian said, his voice regaining its corporate sheen. "I've framed the corrective measures as a pre-planned phase of the aerodynamic testing. It's cleaner that way. We don't need the public knowing how close we came to a collapse." Arthur turned. He looked at Julian, and then at the rest of the board. For the first time in his career, he didn't care about the optics. He didn't care about the clean narrative. He felt a sudden, sharp disgust for the world of polished lies he had built. "The announcement is changing," Arthur said, his voice low and unwavering. "Arthur, don't be a martyr," Julian sighed. "The girl was brilliant, yes. We'll pay her well. We'll even pay her tuition. But she doesn't belong in the credits." Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver fountain pen. He laid it on the center of the table. It looked small against the vast expanse of mahogany, but to Arthur, it carried more weight than the building itself. "She's not a girl, Julian. Her name is Lily Sterling. And she didn't just consult. She saved your reputation, your company, and every life within 3 blocks of that site. If she isn't the face of the Aegis Tower, then my name doesn't belong on it either. I'm resigning as lead architect, effective immediately unless the firm endows a permanent structural fellowship in her name and appoints her as the lead consultant for the completion phase." The silence in the room was brittle. Julian looked at the pen, then at the fire in Arthur's eyes. He realized that for Arthur this wasn't a negotiation, it was a conversion. 6 months later. The grand opening of the Aegis Tower was an event of local legend. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a long, golden glow over the city. A stage had been set up in the marble-clad lobby, teeming with journalists, city officials, and the architectural elite of the country. Lily stood in the wings, her heart hammering a familiar rhythm. She wasn't wearing the borrowed charcoal suit from the boutique. She was wearing a deep navy dress she had bought with her first real paycheck. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. She looked at her hands. They were still calloused, a permanent map of the years she had spent surviving, but they were no longer stained with bleach. She heard her name called, not as a waitress, not as a secret, but as an engineer. Arthur was at the podium. He looked younger than he had on that rainy night at the bistro. The cynical mask had been replaced by a quiet, profound pride. He stepped back as Lily walked onto the stage. The applause was deafening. Lily looked out at the crowd and saw Noah from the bistro and even Marcus, who looked confused but impressed. But she only cared about the man standing next to the podium. Arthur didn't reach for her hand this time. He simply stepped aside, giving her the space she had earned. "I spent 3 years thinking my mind was a burden," Lily began, her voice clear and resonant, amplified by the high ceilings she had helped design. "I thought my circumstances defined my capacity. But buildings, like people, are not meant to be static. They are meant to move. They are meant to breathe, and sometimes the only way to stand tall is to learn how to lean into the wind." The party continued below, but Lily and Arthur took the private elevator to the 90th floor, the observation deck. The air was thin and cold, but the view was infinite. The city of Chicago stretched out beneath them, a sea of lights beginning to flicker to life. They stood at the glass edge, the very place where the wind would have torn the building apart if not for Lily's math. "You're going to be late for your first lecture," Arthur said, leaning against the rail. His shoulder brushed hers, a light, intentional contact that sent a warm shiver through her. "I'm the lead consultant," Lily joked, looking at him with a mischievous glint in her eyes. "I think the professor will understand if I'm 5 minutes late." Lily had spent the last 6 months finishing her degree. She hadn't accepted a free pass. She had sat for every exam, completed every credit, and defended her thesis with a ferocity that had left the faculty in awe. She was no longer hiding. She was a licensed engineer, and her first project was the most famous building in the world. Arthur turned to her. The golden hour light caught the blue of his eyes, making them look soft, almost vulnerable. "I realized something today," he said, his voice dropping to that low velvet she had first heard in the diner. "I spent 10 years trying to build things that would last forever. But the only thing I ever built that actually mattered was the bridge that brought me to you." Lily looked at him, the weight of their journey settling into a peaceful, earned silence. She thought of the cold walk to the subway, the free textbooks, and the crumpled napkins. She thought of the man who had been arrogant enough to dismiss her and brave enough to change. "You didn't build the bridge alone, Arthur," she whispered. She reached into her small clutch and pulled out the silver fountain pen. She pressed it into his hand. "I think you should keep this, to remind you that the smartest person in the room might be the one clearing your table." Arthur laughed, a warm, genuine sound that was lost to the wind. He took the pen, but instead of putting it away, he used his other hand to gently cup her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a touch of such tenderness that Lily felt her breath catch. "I don't need a pen to remember that," he said. "I see you, Lily. I've never seen anything else as clearly as I see you." He leaned in, and this time, there was no crowd, no board of directors, and no storm. There was only the quiet triumph of 2 souls who had found their center of mass. As they kissed, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the Aegis Tower stood perfectly still, holding them both safe above the world. Lily Sterling had achieved her dream through grit, study, and a mind that refused to be silenced. And in the process, she had taught the most famous architect in the city that the strongest structures aren't made of steel. They are built on the courage to be seen.